Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, how you doing? It's Alexander Hilly123 here, and it's time for a new video. And as you can see from the title, today I'm talking about the band Anathema, and I'm going to be detailing all their albums from best to worst, or we'll actually be doing worst to best. Now, I did this for the band Catatonia back in 2016. Two of my favourite bands of all time, Catatonia and Anathema. Both started as gothic doom metal bands. Both have changed their style so much since then. They've both evolved, but they've always sounded so different to each other. And a lot of those early 90s and mid 90s bands are some of my favourites, alongside with Paradise Lost and My Dying Bride. And I do prefer the later years, to be honest with you, because especially as I get older, I'm 31 years old now, I'm not as into heavier music as I used to be, but I really can appreciate all the stuff that they've done. Now, whenever a band change their style dramatically, there are always old school fans who want them to go back to the music they did 20, 30 years ago. It's not going to happen. It's a polar shift. It's a complete different mindset, especially with this band, because they had a hiatus, which they're currently going through now, by the way. It's the main reason why I wanted to make this video, because they're definitely one of the best bands this country's ever made, definitely one of the most underrated. People know who they are. If you like rock music and you're really into your music, people have heard them at some stage or another, but of course they should be a lot more popular, but that's just the way the world works, isn't it? So much shit on the radio, and modern music is absolutely garbage. But yeah, I want to get through this quickly, because I've made this video a few times and it's kind of not gone well. You'd think, well, you're just speaking in front of a webcam, how hard can it be? Slurring my speech, I've not made a video in quite a while, I'm banging on, talking some shit. It's not easy, ladies and gentlemen, it's really not easy, and I know people probably give me a bit of stick with this video as well, because with a band like Anathema, you've got to understand that they've done 11 albums, and everyone is going to have a different ranking and a different listing of their albums, and that's just fine. I actually love that. I love seeing people's opinions. I go on Sputnik Music, that's one of my favourite websites for music reviews, and people giving like a 3 out of 5 for my favourite albums from the band, and then they're saying some of the ones that I'm not as keen on, they're masterpieces, and it's good to get a different perspective. But yeah, if you like rock music, if you like metal music, dark, brooding stuff, but very heartfelt, very heartfelt and real, then you should really check this band out. For me, the best band that Liverpool have ever created. Beatles, you're at number 2, I'm afraid. I'm sure the band themselves would be like cringing at that. You know, I'm a big Beatles fan, but these guys have made music that is just on a higher level for me. And like I say, that early mid-90s doom movement was so damn good. But these guys have had a bigger change than the other bands in those genres. Anyway, bloody hell, I'm getting warm. Yeah, the radiator's on. Need to turn that off. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to get some hate for this, but it is what it is. Starting in at number 11 is Serenades, the debut album in 1993. The production's muddy. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly, so I do apologise. But with this album, muddy production. The Kavanagh brothers are not on the vocals. Mr. Danny Kavanagh, Mr. Vincent Kavanagh, they have been Anathema since the start. But on the first album, Mr. Darren White was on vocals. Now, he left the band after this album, and I never found out why exactly. His vocals are pretty decent, but like I say, the production's muddy as hell. The band knew what they wanted to be. It's full-on heavy as shit, devastatingly depressing doom metal, but it's just, I wanted to make sure before doing this video that I listened to every album twice over. Now, like I said, the band have made 11 albums. 9 of the 11 albums I know start to finish, and trust me, they've not made a bad album. But this album and one other in the list, admittedly, I didn't know as much as the others. So maybe in time, this album and the other one I'm talking about, it's actually next on the list, my order could change. And trust me, I've looked at this order a number of times and I'm still not happy with it, guys. It is the way it is. This band have made so much good shit. But yeah, my favourite track from each album I'm going to be putting in the drop down box. And for this one, if you actually think you couldn't get into this kind of music, then give Sleepless a listen, because it sounds like a metal version of The Cure. It's definitely very catchy, the catchiest on the album. Very short, but still very heavy and brooding. and it's just a great track. They Will Always Die and Sleep Insanity are my other favourites on the album. Now, running in at number 10, ladies and gentlemen, we're going from the bookends of their career, actually, interestingly enough, because it is The Optimist, released just 3 years ago in 2017. And doing the list like I'm doing, I'm going to have to name drop different albums. It's not telling you guys which album is coming up next, but it might give you, the way I speak about every album might give you an inkling as to what's coming up. Because The Optimist was only released 3 years ago. I do know the album, I've listened to it a lot, and hey, I like the album, it's a good album, but I do feel, and I hate to be critical, because once we get into the top 7, I'm not going to be saying a bad word about these bloody albums, trust me, but I feel with this album, the songwriting isn't quite as good, and there's an urgency and immediacy in the earlier music that isn't quite here with The Optimist. I don't think the songwriting's quite as good, and there's, I think for the first time, maybe the female vocalist, Miss Lee Douglas, she's a very wonderful lady indeed, ladies and gentlemen. I think she's singing on here possibly more than Vincent Kavanagh, and I'm much more about the male vocalists. There are some female vocals I love, you know, Beth Gibbons, Portishead, Joni Mitchell, a few others here and there of course, but overall I'm much more into male vocalists. Her vocals are astonishing, she's featuring some of my favourite tracks from the band, but on this album her tracks just didn't do it for me. And the title track Springfield is possibly one of my least favourite things that the band have ever done. The one I'm putting down in the drop down box is Can't Let Go. It's very repetitive, and I do feel like repetition and a lack of stellar songwriting does appear in this album, but Can't Let Go has an urgency about it. You've got these incredibly fast drums, and there's also, I think, with this album and the one before it, Distant Satellites, also a bit of an electronic edge to the music as well, as the evolution continued. Listen, The Optimist, it's a good album, still really like it, but there's there's a few duds here that I can't get into. I feel bad for saying it, but hey, let's move on to number 9, The Silent Enigma, their second album, released in 1995. And now, of course, Mr. Darren White has left the band, leaving Vincent and Danny in full control of the band, and this is a cleaner, slightly, production than Serenades, and for me, this is just better than Serenades in every single way. The first two tracks, Restless Oblivion and Shroud of Frost, are absolutely humongous, crushing, doomy riffs, and this screeched growling. It's not high-pitched screaming and growling, it's low-pitched, guttural, and it's really, really good. I remember when I first got into the band, and I think it's important I tell you guys when I got into the band. Well, I got into the band in early 2009 with the EP Hindsight, and I think sometimes the way that you get into a band matters a lot, because Hindsight was basically an EP of earlier tracks in the band's career. So when I went to listen to the original tracks, I couldn't get into them as much as the ones on Hindsight. But when I was getting into them, I was getting into all sorts of the material, and I could listen to the Silent Enigma stuff and then the later stuff, which is much more, I'd say, Pink Floyd inspired mainly, and enjoy them both, because I was getting into so much music. You know, 2009, I was 19, and this was amazing. Like Restless Oblivion and Shroud of Frost helped me through some dark times indeed. But my favourite, apart from Restless Oblivion, which is in the drop down, is A Dying Wish. Tell you, it's a big album, ladies and gentlemen, and you couldn't really tell with this album, in my opinion, that they were drifting away from their doom roots, but indeed they were, because at album number 8, it is Eternity, which incredibly was released only a year after the Silent Enigma. And there's an angel on the front, and you could definitely see a polar shift in terms of the style of music here. There's a lot more David Gilmour-esque guitar solos. Some people think David Gilmour's kind of trademarked that style and you can't imitate it and do other songs yourself. Well, you can. In any art form, I've always thought that taking inspiration and making it into your own is absolutely fine. It's not just completely copying, you're making your own music. There's only so much you can do with a guitar, and these guys are choosing to do some fantastic David Gilmour-esque solos. a lot more than most modern rock bands do. But anyway, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going off on a tangent. This album, for me, is a lot more spacious and airy, of course, than the earlier Doom material. There's an absolutely fantastic outro with Ascension, the last track on the album. The cover from Roy Harper and David Gilmour himself, actually, which I'm guessing they did in the 70s. That's the one I'm putting in the drop-down box, called Hope. So beautiful. Great rendition of that track. Always love that. And you've got a good balance here of certain things like maybe The Beloved and Suicide Veil, which hark back to the first two albums, but also a track like Angelica could never have been on that album. It is a beautiful piece of music, and it's very emotive. Awesome shit. Eternity. Really like this album, but it's still at number 8 because I think that they do this style better on subsequent albums. By the way, ladies and gentlemen, this album runs in at 58 minutes in length. These guys give you a lot of content, they certainly do. But now we're going back much more modern. Number 7 is 2014's Distant Satellites. This is the album before, this is the 10th album by the way, before The Optimist. This of course is at number 8, so it's not one of my ultimate favourites, and after listening to it and digesting it back when it came out in 2014, I was like, you know what, this is a really solid album, but I don't quite like it as much as the two that came before it. I think this is as well where an electronic influence was starting to become a thing with the band, and Lee Douglas's influence continues with this album. And you know, I hope I didn't sound like I was calling her out before, because on this album she's on top form. The one I'm putting in the drop down box is the Lost Song Part 2. Now, at this moment in time, as I'm speaking, I've on a Word document on my computer, got all the tracks as my favourite, which I'm going to leave in the drop down box for you guys to listen to. But I put the Lost Song Part 2, but you should really listen to 1, 2 and 3 together. The first two songs on the album, there's a Lost Song Part 1 and then another song, Lost Song Part 2. They're both similar melodies, but one's on piano, one's on guitar basically. They did something very similar with Weather Systems, the album before this. My camera is auto-focusing for some reason. And Part 2, I tell you, this is brooding music early in the career, but they may change, they may be making music that more people may like. Now it's more accessible, no growl vocals, it's obviously just not metallic at all, but there's still a lot of feeling. And the Lost Song Part 2, a band like Anathema, somewhere down the line they've made music that's meant a lot emotionally to people, and this track, it certainly has to me, for personal reasons. It is one of the most beautiful songs ever made, and it's phenomenal. I feel like this album, I spoke about it with The Optimist, I think that the songwriting here isn't quite as good as it was in the earlier years and the albums leading up to Distant Satellites, but I still really like it. Dusk, Dark is Descending is a much more brooding and kind of darker piece, and that's something that these guys have always done so well. If you make an album full of songs like Lost Song Part 2 and it's at one pace through the whole thing, you're going to get bored. Just like an album by, I don't know, an alternative metal band who make chugging riffs all the time, like Helmet, for example. I fucking love Helmet. But it gets dull if it's all one style throughout the whole frigging thing. And these guys know that, and the pacing of the songs and where they put them for most of their career has been absolutely fantastic. Uriel as well is a fantastic song here. You're Not Alone, Firelight, Distant Satellites, Take Shelter. The second half of the album, I think, isn't quite as strong, although Distant Satellites is very repetitive. Like I say, songwriting not quite as good, but I still really like this album, and it's a beautiful cover as well. Absolutely gorgeous front cover. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now heading into the stuff that is on a fucking other level, lad. I'm telling you now. We're going back to 2001 for A Fine Day to Exit. Absolutely fantastic cover of this as well, and I'm not going to go into specifics, but A Fine Day to Exit and The Optimist are actually linked thematically, like story wise. This was released in 2001, and there was a bit of controversy when this album came out because all the gothic edge. I mean, it's been years since they've done doom metal since then, but any kind of gothic edge had been taken out of the music. There were less solos, and people were talking about Radiohead. One of the best bands this country's ever produced. Tom York's a genius, even though I don't think me and him would get on, to be perfectly honest, but he's a genius, and they made some of the best music ever made. Astonishing, and taking influence from them is certainly not a bad thing. And for me, with this album, it's not like Anathema are making happy-go-lucky pop songs. It's still dark, it's still brooding, underworld, panic, release, pressure. There's a lot of great acoustic guitars on this album, obviously taking away some, not all, but some of those solos in terms of putting some good guitar pieces in there. They knew they had to vary it up, and I think they did, to be perfectly honest with you. It's not one of my ultimate favourite Anathema albums, of course, it's only at number 6, but some people view this as the odd one out from the classic material, but I still think it's absolutely fantastic. It's over 60 minutes in length as well, so there's a lot of shit to digest here. And the one that I'm putting as my favourite is Release. It just explodes with an amazing guitar piece in the middle, and I don't think there's as many melancholic tracks here, many emotional songs, although Temporary Peace, the hindsight version, you need to listen to it, ladies and gentlemen. It is so incredible. Right, now we are in at the top 5. My legs are starting to hurt. I need to move and get off this seat. Bloody hell. It is We're Here Because We're Here. This was released in 2010, and this came after the 7-year hiatus in between A Natural Disaster and this album. And you've got to understand that 7 years out of the game, when before this and after this album, they'd been making albums once every 2-3 years, the landscape had changed in terms of music. You know, Spotify was now a thing. Last FM at the time was a very big thing. Last FM is garbage these days, but back in 2010 it was massive, helped me get into a lot of music, and YouTube was at its peak in terms of being a platform that people could share thoughts on before they started shutting down people's minds. They didn't want people communicating and actually, you know, doing things for each other. And you know, I remember what YouTube was like in the early days. Arguments about politics and religion, some interesting people talking about some highbrow shit. These days, just look at the front page of YouTube. For goodness sake, it's unbelievable. But yeah, the landscape of music had changed, and the band had changed as well. I don't think there'd been a bigger shift from one album to the next of this band as much as A Natural Disaster, released in 2003. We will get onto that behemoth of an album, ladies and gentlemen. And this album, We're Here Because We're Here. It's a lot lighter, and also there's a more spiritual edge. I can tell that something must have happened in the brains of the Caverners between the 7 years they were gone, A Natural Disaster, and this album, because musically, lyrically, it's a lot lighter, it's a lot more positive. And a lot of the time when rock bands do that kind of shit, the music struggles to be as good and as immediate, as urgent, and for me, as meaningful. But this album, no problem in terms of any of those things, because it's a stellar album, incredibly consistent, yet again running in at 58 minutes in length. This was the first album where Lee Douglas is an official band member. The production is possibly the best of their career. Mr. Stephen Wilson, the god himself, Porcupine Tree, mixed the album. And yeah, there's a lot of progressive tracks here, solos, gorgeous guitar pieces. Both Caverners, I think, are singing on it. And there's a good balance and a good mix, and it was just a great return to form, and it also most certainly got them a lot of new fans. This album came out the year after I got into the band, and I was like, yeah, I'm so excited for the future and what it has to hold for these guys as well. And I think I bought Weather Systems. I didn't buy We're Here Because We're Here, right? Illegally downloaded it. But since then, I've got about 2 or 3 different pieces of merchandise, purchased some albums, and you know, that's another thing that had really changed in the 7 years that they'd gone. You know, people were now starting to illegally download albums, but then give back in terms of turning up to the venue, you know, visiting and watching them do the shit live. Yes, sorry if I'm starting to talk a bit of shit, ladies and gentlemen. 20 minutes in, I'm struggling now. But yeah, the track that I'm putting in the drop down is, let's have a look, A Simple Mistake, which has a more brooding edge to it than a lot of the tracks on the album. And this outro is amazing. There's also a bit of a post-rock influence, more so than the early stuff here, I would say, as well. Not into post-rock, but these guys, I guess it might be an influence of theirs. And there's another song later we're going to talk about specifically, which is influenced by post-rock. Now, in at number 4, ladies and gentlemen, is the album Weather Systems, released in 2012, just, less than 2 years after We're Here Because We're Here. And I'm guessing they wanted to strike immediately with the critical acclaim to We're Here Because We're Here. They got back in the studio, and for me, this is a better album because it's more concise. It's very similar, but I think it just does a better job. Like I say, it's more concise, less tracks. It runs in 55 minutes, so it's still quite a long album. But, like I say, production, lyrics, vocals. For me, this is a better album than We're Here Because We're Here. Yet, if you look online, the general consensus would be that this is slightly worse, but I think it's slightly better. It doesn't matter. They're both bloody brilliant albums. Untouchable Part 1 is possibly one of the most lyrically inspiring songs I've ever heard. And at this stage, I think a word I would use is goosebump inducing. Untouchable Part 1 is certainly that. Part 2 is great as well. Now remember, I was talking about Distant Satellites, the Lost song. Well, Untouchable, that's got a Part 1 and a Part 2. One guitar-based, heavier, one slower, more moody and melancholic. But it's Part 1 that I prefer here. It's gorgeous. Lightning Song, absolutely fantastic. Great name for it as well. It very much fits. But ladies and gentlemen, Goosebumps, I've just got them. Because the last 3 tracks on this album are absolutely stonking. In fact, the second half of this album is just so good. It's so good. Dare I say that this album's maybe just a little bit underrated in the discography. I mean, it's seen as a great album, but like I say, most people prefer We're Here Because We're Here. The Storm Before the Calm, and then the last 3, The Beginning and the End, The Lost Child, and Internal Landscapes. We've got to talk about these 3 tracks. The Beginning and the End kind of harks back, I'd say, to Judgment. It's more immediate. It's got an absolutely gorgeous guitar solo. It's a bit more darker, brooding, shit like that. But then The Lost Child, I'm guessing it's Vincent who's doing it, but he's not singing, so you can't really tell. But he's doing this kind of humming, and it's an a cappella hum. It's like, and it just works so well. You're just thinking to yourself, why the fuck have more bands not done this kind of shit? It's just a cappella, him doing this beautiful harmony, humming, and it actually feels really good when you hum. There's some science to it. If you look online, kind of spiritual shit, where the humming, the noise, the vibration can actually do good for you. That's why you see the, Buddhists do it and whatnot. Like I say, I'm not the spiritual type, but it feels good to do, and this track itself is just, it's dark, but it's beautiful. It's on another level. It's bloody genius. And the last 2 songs, 7 minutes long and then 9 minutes long. So there's some lengthy tracks here. Very progressive indeed. You know, I'm not spoken about the word progressive, but loving Pink Floyd, like I know the band do. You know, the progressive rock edge after Eternity really took off. And then a song called Internal Landscapes. Now, the one I've put in the drop-down box is The Beginning and the End, because I think it's easier for you guys to potentially enjoy as a first time listen. But Internal Landscapes, I tell you, it's one of the most moving tracks I've ever heard in my life. The intro is a guy talking about, I can't remember, I googled it a few weeks ago when I was doing this list, but he's talking about something went horribly wrong. He was dying. The doctors somehow saved him, but I don't even think the doctors saved him. He somehow came back to life. He thought he was dying. He was saying goodbye to his wife. The dialogue is from an interview. It's a recording from an interview, and that's going on whilst the music's playing. The lyrics fit perfectly. It's astonishing. It's on another level, and there are certain pieces of music which have made me well up, and that is definitely one of them. It's one of the best pieces of music ever made, ladies and freaking gentlemen. Anyway, number 3 in the list now, we are going way back to 1998 for Alternative 4. It's got an angel on the front, ladies and gentlemen, and this sees the band in a much more scathing mentality, definitely more so than 3 of the last 4 albums I've spoken about. You've got to understand here that this album is sandwiched in between Eternity and Judgment, and those albums, they're not the happiest of albums. And Alternative 4 in the clean vocal era might just be the most downtrodden and depressing thing they've ever released. Some of these lyrics are scathing, they're angry, and I love it all. Shroud of False, Fragile Dreams. Now, I was speaking before about how I listened to this band at the start with hindsight. When I listened to Fragile Dreams, it took me time to get into it because it's more of a rock vibe. There's a bit of a hard riff there, and I got into it with hindsight, which is just based on piano. But yeah, Fragile Dreams is amazing. Empty, Lost Control, Reconnect, Inner Silence. My least favourite track here is Alternative 4, which apparently Mr. Duncan Patterson, I think his name's Duncan, isn't it? Yeah, Duncan Patterson did. You Google Duncan Patterson, he's had a long and illustrious career, very talented guy. He left the band, I think, after this album, or after Judgment. But that was his song. Regret, which definitely has a big Pink Floyd influence to it. The solo's amazing. Lyrics, very downtrodden, like I say. Feel, and then Destiny. But the track which I'm putting in the drop-down list here is... Oh, let me have a look. Oh, there you go. Lost Control. That song, the word I would use is dramatic. It is very dramatic. This thundering riff with these incredibly melancholic and sad vocals. It's just absolutely unbelievable. But this album running in at 45 minutes in length, but there are 10 tracks on the album, very different from the more modern stuff which I've just been talking about. But yeah, Alternative 4, amazing album, and maybe some people will be a bit surprised to see it's so high up, but yeah, it's one I've always loved. Anyway, number 2, ladies and gentlemen, is A Natural Disaster, released in 2003, 2 years after A Fine Day to Exit. A Fine Day to Exit, I spoke of before, still a solid album, but people felt that they were taking too much influence from Radiohead and alternative rock bands, perhaps. This album, for me, is the most doomy thing they've done post-Doom. Are you with me right now? Because the production's great, and there's just a darker tone to this album that I feel personally. There's also a track on Decoder, is it called? What people would call like auto-tune, kind of robot voice. That's the 3rd track on the album, called Closer. But you think, oh, auto-tune, Decoder, blah, 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 it's going to be poppy, it's going to be all this. It isn't whatsoever. It's very repetitive, but it gets louder and louder and more aggressive, and then explodes at the end. And Harmonium Balance, the track Are You There? That's a more melancholic track. And then the track that I think I mentioned this earlier. To be fair, I was speaking about taking influence from other bands is fine, but there's one track on this album which sounds just like Pink Floyd's Sheep. I think it's Sheep anyway. Pulled Under 2,000 meters a second. Listen to that and then listen to Sheep, I think, by Pink Floyd, and they are incredibly similar indeed. Most people have picked up on that online. It doesn't really matter though, because it's a great track, and it's an incredibly heavy and aggressive track. I don't know where the hell it came from, because that's probably the heaviest thing they did for a long time after the Doom era at the start of their career. And then A Natural Disaster, Flying, and in the drop down box, I said that these guys know how to close an album. Well, they do. I'm going to put Electricity in the drop down because it was the soundtrack to a bit of misery for me personally. It's a bit of a love song, ladies and gentlemen, but don't be put off. It is phenomenal. It's beautiful, and there are some lyrics of this person, self-reflection is the right word, but the electricity, oh my god, You just got to listen to it. It's in the drop-down menu. There's no excuses. You've got to listen to it. But the last track, and the one I want to talk about more, is the 10-minute 48 Violence, which is instrumental, very, very influenced by post-rock, and dare I say it, unlike anything else they've ever done in their career. It starts off slow, it starts off beautiful, and ends up with thunderous riffs, and it just leaves you feeling emotionally destroyed. It's an amazing piece of music, and for me, it destroys a lot of post-rock bands' whole careers in one track. You've got to check out Violence. It's phenomenal. It's absolutely amazing, gorgeous. It feels like it's 3 or 4 songs in one, and I like it when a band call instrumental tracks certain names. You can kind of get an insight into where they were coming from. Trent Reznor of 9 Inch Nails is great with that kind of shit as well. His title tracks and instrumental tracks are always worded really well, and it's just Violence. The good and the bad, the yin and the fucking yang. I need to stop talking shit, ladies and gentlemen. But it's all there. Second favourite Anathema album, A Natural Disaster, and a beautiful art cover as well. But ladies and gentlemen, in at number 1, if you're a big Anathema fan, you know what's coming. Yes, indeed, it is number 1. Yes, it indeed is the best. I've got this one on vinyl. In my vinyl collection now, I've got 35 vinyls, only one Anathema. If I had to have another on vinyl, I'd probably go more modern and pick Weather Systems, to be honest with you. But I've got this one on vinyl. It's in the collection. I should have brought it out to show you guys. But it is Judgment, released in 1999. This is sandwiched in between Find Day to Exit and Alternative 4. For me, production, lyrics, vocals, the balance, the pacing of the album, the length. To be honest, 11 albums in, there's a few that could potentially be called masterpieces by these guys, but this is definitely the ultimate masterpiece. There's not a bad track, there's not a bad moment, there's not a bad I don't know, everything is just so well placed. There are 13 tracks on the album. It runs in at 60 minutes in length, and you've just got, yet again, an amazing balance of faster, heavier tracks, scathing lyrics about relationships and hatred and all these typical kinds of things that, even though the band aren't making doom metal anymore, you would lyrically expect to hear in a doom metal song or band. And then there are these more beautiful moments like Parisian Moonlight, where I think Miss Lee Douglas made her debut with a band with that track, her lyrics, her vocals I should say, on that track, and it is just amazing. Don't Look Too Far. The Gilmour-esque solos are at their peak here. They're astonishing. If you like progressive rock, you should definitely give this a listen, but it's still got that gothic edge. It's at the peak of the gothic lyrics, and like I said before, the scathing nature, because there was a lot of anger, I think, with these lyrics, like Forgotten Hopes. You have a look at the lyrics for Forgotten Hopes. There's about this alcoholic guy who's just wasting away. Make It Right, FFS, that stands for fuck's sake, I do believe. And then One Last Goodbye. In the build-up to this album, I do believe that the brothers' mother had passed away, and this was a tribute to her. And there won't be a dry eye in the building, ladies and gentlemen, or pair of eyes in the building. It would be strange if you cried for just one eye. Both will be crying, because it's one of the most beautiful songs ever made, one of the most beautiful odes to somebody ever made, and they should be rightfully proud of it. It's one of the greatest pieces of music ever made. And then the final track, 2000 and Gone, which is a beautiful little instrumental, and knowing what I know about the writing of this album towards their mum, I'd like to think that song title, 2000 and Gone, is for her. But anyway, in the drop down box, I am going to put Anyone Anywhere, because the lyrics are so soul searching and just tell of somebody yearning to be understood, and it's amazing. The Wings of God before it, with these guitars that sound unlike anything I've ever heard before. It's very urgent and very brooding. And yeah, ladies and gentlemen, Judgment for me is the best Anathema album, because it just encapsulates everything they've done throughout the whole career, and it's a dark listen. It's possibly the most consistently unsettling album, and most people do love it, and I would hazard a guess, if for whatever reason, just go along with my little made up thing here, if there was a survey amongst the fans which is their best album, this might not be number one, but it would always be in the top 3 for me. Ladies and gentlemen, that is my, I don't know what I'm going to call this, because with Catatoni we did a top 10, but these guys have made 11, so doing a top 11, it's not very catchy, is it? People aren't going to want to watch a top 11, so I might just do worst to best, but it's all good shit with these guys, and hopefully one day they will return. But like I said at the start of the video, due to the corona at this moment in time, they've decided to call it, and they've decided that they wanted to do a tour, a 10-year anniversary of We're Here Because We're Here. They've not been able to do that, and I hope that one day they will return. But for now, one of the greatest bands that this country has ever given us have called it quits. And if you've never listened to them, you've got a lot of songs in the drop down box, and go on Wikipedia, have a look at the discography, and whatever music you like that's similar to what Anathema have made with that particular album, give it a listen. I think you'll be pleasantly, well, not pleasantly surprised, but I think you will be happy indeed. But anyway, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to start rambling now, because making a video without any edits for 37 minutes is not easy. Have a look at the top YouTubers. How many edits do they make in a 5-minute video? Think about it. Think about it. When you think I'm talking shit, it ain't easy to keep talking in one sitting. Anyway, I will be back with a final pickups video, gaming pickups video, and I'll see you soon, guys. Bye bye.